The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
Good evening. When Idaho's primary election polls close later this evening, most estimates have it that about 30% of the voters who are eligible to vote in Idaho in this primary election will have done so. 30% of the population making an election decision for all of us, selecting the legislators, the congressmen, even the president, who will make policy that affects virtually every aspect of American life. Why do so few of us participate in this process? Is it endangering our political system? And what, if anything, can we do about it? Tonight, on election night, we look at some of those questions, and we have called together a panel of political experts to do the looking for us. David Leroy is Idaho's Republican Lieutenant Governor, a politician with experience at both the county and state level in Idaho. Orville Cope is a political science professor at the College of Idaho in Caldwell. Alan Dalton is a professor of economics at Boise State University and is a past chairman of the Idaho Libertarian Party. And Al Rouillet is chairman of the political science department at the University of Idaho in Moscow, where he joins us tonight and is the author of the Idaho Political Handbook. Al Rouillet, let me begin with you. Is the perception, I think that is fairly widespread, correct that fewer and fewer people are both interested and even participating in the political process?
Well, if we look at turnout, which is the percentage of eligible voters voting, it's certainly true that there's been a decline over the last 2 or 3 decades from roughly 65% to 54% in the last presidential election. And in the off-year congressional elections, the turnout is much lower, and even much lower than that in primaries, as you say, around 30% this time in Idaho. A number of reasons are given for this. One, perhaps the reason is the differences, that there are really no differences between parties, that people are see no difference, and so why go out and vote? Another reason is that government is said to be increasingly distant from people, and they have see no reason to participate. On the other hand, some surveys in the last few months and some other people people speculating about politics have said that there will be a rise in turnout in the 1984 presidential election, primarily because of the polarization that has been caused by the Reagan presidency, that he probably more than any other president since Roosevelt, Reagan has made some differences or antagonized classes that brought back class polarization, so that you'll probably...
And the converse is true, too, that he's got great support among large population.
Right, yes. What I mean is that there'll be more people to take a strong position on Reagan than recent presidents. And another factor is that both parties, more than in the past, are engaged in registration drives, particularly registration drives among blacks, who traditionally have the lowest turnout.
Jesse Jackson's effort in that regard.
Sure, and I think if there was Jesse Jackson being the first really serious black candidate, will increase black turnout. He has increased black turnout in primaries in the large urban areas. And if there is a black on the ticket, it would increase black turnout in November.
Governor Leroy, I looked up the figures today just in the presidential election since 1960, when 64% of the eligible voters voted, to the 1980 election where 53.9% voted. It's been just a stair step every 4 years, a decline of a point or a little more. Why do you think that's happened?
Well, I think politics is more complicated in this country, and it tends, therefore, to be easier to ignore or more difficult to participate in intelligently, and therefore the average voter, whoever that is, has a tendency to avoid making tough decisions about which they feel ill-informed, or has a tendency to go do something they'd rather do than follow these complex issues. I think one of the keys in the 60 election was that it was a time of great change, and there were at least one very charismatic candidate in John Kennedy. I think perhaps, as Professor Rouillet says, we'll see a reversal of that downward stair-stepping trend this November, with an exciting incumbent who touches people very strongly one way or the other, and perhaps an exciting challenger.
And Dr. Cope, a lot of people blame this on the decline in the political parties.
Well, I think
you mentioned that.
Yeah, I think in part this is true. Not so much the decline in political parties, because I see them as their functions essentially changing. It's really a decline in identification with a particular party. And going back to some of the comments that Al Rouillet suggested here, that in the early 70s, I believe we extended the vote to the 18-year-olds. We therefore increased the universe of potential voters. The important thing is those 18 to 24-year-olds haven't been voting. It may very well be that they're beginning to start to vote now, that they're entering the electoral process. I see that probably Gary Hart may very well be attractive to them. Another reason for the decline in participation might very well be the mobility of the American citizen. We are probably one of the most mobile of people. We move from community to community. Trying to think back, I've moved at least 5 times in the last 20 years. There may very well be among
Which would, excuse me, would lessen a person's identification with issues in a particular area?
issues. Also, maybe it might loosen his traditional bonds with a political party. He may not be familiar with the personalities and the issues in the community. He may have something else on his mind. One can achieve certain goals in our society without being political, whereas in other cultures you have to be political in order to achieve some of the goals that you desire. There may very well be a sense of powerlessness among minorities, and I'm not just talking about black or Hispanic minorities, because they are certainly, with Jesse Jackson and the Hispanic movement in the United States, they are certainly being brought into the process. But you can go into an area like Appalachia, into Tennessee, Kentucky areas, where you have people who have all kinds of options to participate in the political system, but they don't. You come out to Idaho, and all you have to do, I think, is look at some of the statistics of our participation in general elections. We are among the highest participants in the electoral process. We, Minnesota, South Dakota, Utah, Montana, are states in which you have a high level of participation. There certainly isn't a powerlessness in Idaho when it comes to exercising the vote, with the exception, of course, of primaries.
Yeah. Mr. Dalton, again, it is said from time to time, and much has been written about political parties not maybe standing for things that people can readily identify with. No one's ever accused libertarians of not standing for things that are easily recognizable. Is that a problem, though, for the 2 major political parties?
I'm not so sure that that's the problem that the 2 major political parties have. I think that people know where they stand, major candidates of both major parties. What I really think is the problem is that many voters feel, and this has nothing to do really with the role of political parties, but they just simply feel powerless to effect any change. They see the largeness of government and they say, how can I, as an individual, change that? And I think they feel powerless. So they turn off.
Well, should they feel powerless?
From a scientific viewpoint, to a certain degree, yes. I have part of my economics training in what's called public choice, which is application of economics to political science. And if you look at the probability that any individual voter will affect the outcome of election, and then look at the decision to vote from a cost-benefit viewpoint, the probability is that it becomes a wonder of why people even bother to vote, because it's much more costly.
So the perception may not be incorrect on the part of the average person that they really don't have, as an individual, much influence.
From a scientific viewpoint, that's true. Really, the only people that have a really strong motivation to vote are those who are going to receive large gains or try to prevent large losses in the system. And to the extent that the Reagan presidency has imposed large losses or large gains, not saying how it's gone, within the system, that should increase political participation this year. Also, voting is a normal good, as economists talk about it, and these 18 to 24-year-olds are becoming richer, and they'll vote more.
Governor Leroy?
Well, I think you can make a case that the voters should be very interested, and while many major races passed by thousands and thousands of votes in margin, there have been major races in this state and recently and all over the country in its history where one vote literally has made a difference. For instance, John Kennedy, the 1960 presidential race, where we talked about all that turnout, was won by one vote per precinct across the country by Kennedy. And had those votes gone for Nixon, he would have been president. One vote per precinct in this country.
And I'm sure we'll decide some legislative races later tonight that'll be decided by literally a handful of votes in some cases.
Literally true. In the most recent governor's race here in Idaho, a switch of 2 1/4 votes per precinct in Idaho would have made Phil Batt governor of the state.
Well, one point I'd like to make, too, in talking about public choice here, some people today are making multiple choices when it comes to voting, particularly in flotarial districts and in those at-large districts and the new reapportionment. Some people are going to have, as I calculate, I hope I'm correct here, they're going to have 6 choices, 2 for the Senate, and they will have 4 choices for the House. In 6 legislative districts in Idaho. That's power.
And that makes it much more costly for the citizenry to become informed, and therefore it makes it harder for the citizen to decide what he's going to do, and therefore it makes it less likely that they'll vote. So that's a problem with the flotarials.
Do you agree that that makes it less likely that they would vote?
At the outset, one may be confronted with so many different options and not quite sure what the rules and regulations are that they'll back off and not participate. But voting is a habit, and once you start it, you don't give it up.
And Professor Rouillet, you want to make a comment here?
Yes, you had asked earlier what would we suggest that would improve turnout, and I think if we look at Western Europe, the major difference between the nations of Western Europe and the United States is in registration laws, and the United States has a lower turnout than any of the Western European nations, and I think if we made some effort to change your registration laws in this country, that we would increase turnout.
Change them in what way?
Well, for example, election day registration. Minnesota is one of the few states in the country that has election day registration. It has the highest turnout in the country. In most states in this country, registration is a personal effort. In other words, you have to go down to the county clerk's office and register. In Western European countries, including Canada, election officials register the people without the personal effort, so that they continue to update the registration books. And so if we did make it easier for registration, like going to register as you vote, then I think there would be a slightly higher turnout, much higher, probably 10 points higher than there is now across the country.
There's a considerable resistance to that, though, Governor.
Well, I agree that we should make an effort, a frequent effort, to purge non-voters from those lists, people who've died, people who've moved away, people who've indicated a lack of interest in participating by not having shown up the last couple of 3 times. But I don't think the system really needs an artificial manipulation of higher percentages of turnout. If you take the Secretary of State's estimated 30% for turnout tonight, you will find on 520,000 or so registered voters, we're looking at 156,000 people participating. If you manipulated those lists and got us up to 40% or 50%, the fact is you would still have about 156,000 people participating. That's a fair sample, it's a fair involvement. I think it should be easy to play. We should encourage people by a reasonably easy system, accurate as it can be, but still easy, system of registration.
A day of voting registration?
Well, I've never been too hot on anything that would lend itself to fraud or other manipulations of that type. Postcard registration, those sorts of things. And we can devise a system that would allow people to register on the day of voting, but it would have to be carefully controlled, and it would probably be fairly expensive to make sure they didn't register here and there and everywhere else.
Professor Rouillet?
Well, again, getting back, I think that if we look at the other states around the country, the lowest turnout has been in the Deep South, and then the Deep South has historically had the most difficult registration laws. And one of the reasons why Idaho has had one of the highest registration law, highest turnout in the country is because other than Election Day registration, we probably have the easiest registration laws in the country.
Well, you mentioned the European system. One of the, I guess, some see as a strength of the European system is, for example, they vote in many countries, in France and Italy, on the weekend, vote on Sunday.
Yeah, that would be, we could try that as well. Of course, the Constitution says that the general elections have to be the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, but primaries could be on Sunday or Saturday.
I would say that if we went to a weekend voting, that our participation would probably be lower, merely because, especially in Idaho, on the weekends, you don't stay in Boise
Right.
on average, and
Right.
so I don't think that would help much, at least in Idaho. It might help in some areas of the country, but I don't think that would help.
I would agree. I would agree, yes.
I think the postcard idea and a few days before registration might very well be appropriate if one could prove residency. We do have easy access now to registration if you can find your registrar. When I moved into Boise, went down to the county building and find out where I was to register, and found out it was my next door neighbor. But at least I took the effort, and we still have to take the effort to register.
Another thing the Europeans have over us, largely perhaps because of the different forms of media there, is that the campaigns tend to be much shorter, compressed into just a few weeks as opposed to several months or even years in this country. Is that a problem? Do you think people get so much of politics inundated in the newspapers, on television, candidates are always around, that contributes to this problem?
Well, I think, frankly, we will see a low turnout tonight, in part because we've had an off again, on again, off again, on again primary again. Mm-hmm. The fact that we have had so many troubles with reapportionment, questions about when candidates would file, questions about new districts, questions about whether or not we would have a primary on in May at all, I think are a great disincentive to both voters and candidates. But interestingly enough, let me give you the politicians' side of this low turnout situation. You know, in Idaho, when you're out there campaigning on the street, literally shaking hands, that only 3 out of every 10 people that you meet are likely to turn out and vote. You know that if you're running as a Republican, 2 of those people are likely to vote in the Republican primary, and therefore you may have some interest in influencing. If you're running as a Democrat, you know that likely 1 out of every 10 people is going to actually have a chance to vote for you by taking that particular ballot in the primary itself. It's very frustrating for both candidates and politicians, and certainly nothing about this particular primary season in Idaho has either been too long or too definite.
Do you subscribe to the theory that the whole confusion about reapportionment, where the boundaries are, who the candidates are, is going to contribute to this problem too?
Oh, I think it will. I think the proliferation of signs in any hometown street in Idaho with new candidates and new district numbers and people you've never heard of and people you probably wouldn't want to hear of, at least until November, is going to be a disincentive to people to come out and vote tonight.
I don't think that would matter much, merely because I don't think most people know who their legislator is now under the old setup. I think voting is a habit, as Orville said, and they do it out of habit, and often it's just go in and whatever name is most familiar. I mean, we all know that politics is primarily a name identification game. So I don't think that that's really going to have very much effect on the turnout. I mean, it appears we're going to have about the same turnout we did in the last off-year election, and so that would indicate that nobody additionally has been turned off.
Well, initially I think that probably some people will be confused about the reapportionment, but I don't see any real issue lighting the fires of the voters to go to the polls this time. Politics right now is the politics of endorsements, the politics of name identification, as Alan suggested. I just don't see that the issues are out front for the public to grab onto. And I agree with David.
Well, whose fault is that? Is that the fault? It's not that we don't have plenty of issues that, I mean, we talk around this table every night about things we think are important. Why aren't the issues coming across to folks? Is that a part at fault of the candidates, the parties? Or
I think
the
probably
media?
it's a fault in part of the candidates. There are people that do get involved in primaries who are, to be frank, are quite inarticulate. There are others that are very, very articulate. On the other hand, you have a dominant one-party or a modified one-party system in Idaho, and I think that the Democratic Party has not played as important role as providing opposition to the Republican Party as it should on specific issues. It takes a great deal of courage, I think, even in primaries, to come out and take a stand on a specific issue. One likes to circumvent issues a little bit in the hope that you will draw upon a larger number of people.
Well, that sounds like almost like an indictment of politicians. Let me have the politician respond to that.
Okay, go ahead.
Frankly, I think the reason that the issues are more poorly developed than usual this time is a combination of the fact that it's a primary where they are always fairly poorly developed. And secondly, because we have about a 1 month to 3 week delay on everything this time because of the uncertainty of whether or not this election was going. We've seen only in the last week to 10 days the kind of personal attacks, the kind of vigor, the kind of dramatic or attempt at dramatic issue development that you usually see during the entire month of a campaign. And it's been compressed to about a week's period this time, largely because nobody really got running, nobody really got interested until just this last few days.
Yes, sir.
Mark, I would add that another factor is that there are really no statewide races that are adding a great deal of enthusiasm, except perhaps the Adamson-Hanson race in the 2nd District. Statewide or in the 1st District, there are no major contests in either party that is generating any enthusiasm. There are a lot of local sheriff's races and commission races that are contested and very hot, but those don't generate interest. You need a statewide race with a lot of publicity and a lot of media to generate interest, and that isn't occurring this time.
I think that if there's going to be any percentages of voting above the 30%, it may come from that 2nd District in the 2nd District race. But I don't think, and there's sort of an accepted opinion by some people that there's going to be a crossover vote for Dan Adamson from the moderates and from certain Democrats. And there's no empirical evidence to show in the political science literature that rating another party's primary has any effect on outcome.
Well, so
there will be some, I'm sure, and some people are going to be doing that, particularly in Ada County, I think.
But even for a person who might think of themselves as a Democrat, without many Democratic races to lure them to the polls today, they're not likely to go to try to influence one race that might be of predominant interest?
Well, if in his particular district or her particular district there is a contest between a Democrat and a LaRouche Democrat, he's going to have to think twice, I think.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Democratic presidential preference primary, which is called today a beauty contest, some call it. I'm wondering if that doesn't contribute a little bit to the confusion and perhaps the lack of people feeling like they have anything to say about the process. I mean, you can vote today for any one of those candidates and it still doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Mr. Dalton?
Well, that's correct. I remember when I was a Democrat, that, we had 76. We had caucuses, and it was a great experience personally. But really, well, in one sense, I think it's perfectly right that it's just a beauty contest, because in a certain sense, it should be the people who are really interested in the political process and who are really Democrats in some sense, who ought to be in the Democratic, selecting Democratic delegates to the National Convention. And in an open primary state, I think there's very good reason to have that sort of setup. On the other hand, it kind of flies in the face of what the Democratic Party has kind of traditionally stood for, and that is we're open to everyone. So that's a problem. But Mondale Hart just doesn't enthuse anyone in Idaho.
Everyone can go to the caucuses if they so choose.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that tends to be a little more groupie oriented. I mean, you're not going to go yourself unless you've got some friends to go with, so you're going to be able to talk with someone there. It's not like going to the.
Well, I'm going
voting booth.
uncommitted, and nobody knows about it.
The Democratic presidential candidates, though, in many ways have waged a terribly vigorous campaign all across the country, going way back to the Iowa caucuses in January, with debates that have been widely publicized, lots of issues, discussion, trying to define the differences between the candidates, but still, most people are ho-humming this race. Am I right?
I think those who are not ho-humming are probably Republicans. It's been a great advantage to the incumbent president for the most part. I think an important distinction should be made, Mark, following up on our last conversation. That is that while the Democrats in Idaho do have caucuses, and for them the primary is literally a beauty contest in all regards, the Republicans have a little bit different system. We elect Republican precinct committee people who then are the only delegates who can go to the county caucuses, the regional caucuses, which then select our state delegates, which then select our national delegates.
Does that reinforce the strength of the party?
Well, I think it does. It gives the precinct people a legitimate role in the selection of the President of the United States, and it puts their name on the ballot in such a way as they have an opportunity to stand on the same ballot with the one candidate this time. We're in a time of Republican contest to be a little more active in declaring themselves perhaps one way or the other. So Republicans, I think, have a superior system in Idaho, though, of course, both systems seem to work.
It is frequently said, and I just have about a minute and a half left, but let me raise this question, that the business that I'm in, namely television, has become such a dominant influence in the political process, and mostly for the bad, in that we trivialize the issues, we tend to report politics like a horse race or a football game, that so much influence is expended by candidates in trying to influence the people who put them on TV, that somehow it has so badly skewed the system. Do you subscribe to that, Dr. Cope?
In part, I do. However, if you include, as the media, also the newspapers, if you're willing to sit down and read the Statesman before election, you might be able to ferret out the issues, whereas you may not get that on television, or for that matter, even from the candidates themselves.
Professor Rouillet, do you think television does trivialize the process by reporting it, as I said, like a football game too often?
Well, I don't think so. I would prefer to see a shorter campaign, I think, with media coverage, but I don't think it trivializes it, no.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm trying to get somebody to criticize television. Do you want to do it?
Why, we're already good on television.
Take your chance.
I'm not exactly sure how the word trivialize would apply. I think television has a tendency to take a trivial mistake or a trivial achievement and turn that into a headline story of the day. But the overall perspective of that accumulated trivia, some of which truly does include major statements, major events, major issues, projected constantly into the front rooms of our voters, I think ends up being probably a better picture of the voters of the candidates.
Sorry, I've got to go. We're out of time, unfortunately. Governor Leroy, Mr. Cope, Mr. Felton, we thank you for joining us tonight. And Professor Rouillet, thank you for joining us in Moscow. We appreciate it. We'll be back later tonight at 9 o'clock Mountain Time, 8 o'clock Pacific Time with our own election coverage continuous throughout the evening. We'll see you then. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.